Hello and welcome to Todos Somos Marcos. I'm pleased today to be talking with Don White of the Committee in Solidarity with El Salvador. Did I say that right, Don?
That's right.
Okay.
CISPAS. It's
CISPAS.
the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador.
With the people of El Salvador.
Right.
Welcome to the show, Don.
It's really a pleasure to be here, Peter.
Now, you've been an activist involved with El Salvador for many years. Let's start off with, the terrible Civil War period and what the U.S. involvement is and what CISPAS involvement was.
Well, the story of El Salvador goes way, way back. Like virtually all of the countries of Latin America, their history goes back to the conquistadors and the Spanish conquest and the imperialism of Spain and so on. But in the modern period, even 1932 is a very important year, because when the Great Depression struck in the United States, in El Salvador, the coffee industry, the coffee plantations, and the work for coffee workers just plummeted. And at that time, there was an insurrection in the country. One of the leaders of that insurrection in 1932 was Faribundo Martí, and he was calling for equitable distribution of wealth and the rights of workers. He was killed in that insurrection, and from that point on, the people of El Salvador were very traumatized. In many parts of the country, they realized that if they rose up against the ruling class, those would be owners of coffee plantations,
Yes.
and the oligarchy, the coffee oligarchy, that a lot of terror and repression would be used against them. But notwithstanding that, after 1932, movements continued, worker organizations, political parties were formed, student movements were formed, and the 1970s were particularly gruesome because death squads were very oppressive.
The oligarchy was fighting back.
The oligarchy was fighting back. They were trying to show the people, the workers, the campesinos, the farmers, the student movement, they were trying to show them that they could not organize, they would not be allowed to organize to actually win basic reforms. So the 70s saw huge numbers of people disappeared. The leadership of unions were massacred. The death squads would wipe out whole families of progressive activists and so on. So the 70s were a very gruesome period. So in 1980 is where we often say kind of the present movement began.
I see.
In 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero was assassinated. The 4 American nuns were killed. The FMLN, the Faribundo Martí National Liberation Front, was formed, made up of 5 organizations that decided to have a armed revolutionary front. Many massacres occurred that year, and CISPAS was formed in 1980.
I see.
That was the U.S. organization that declared open and public solidarity with the FMLN in 1980. So our organization has been active for now almost 18 years.
Well, let me ask you something. I know the U.S. has always been for democracy and social justice, so the government must have been supporting the FMLN all that time too, right?
Quite untrue,
Oh,
Peter. I
another
catch
mistake.
that could have been a tongue-in-cheek question.
A little bit, yeah.
Right. The U.S. government gave nearly $6 billion to the government of El Salvador to defeat this revolutionary front. So during the 1980s, about $1 million a day in military aid was going to the government of El Salvador. At the same time, the government of El Salvador was bombing its own civilian population.
Yep.
They were actually funding death squads and paramilitary units. The people, there were about 1/5 of the population who either became internally displaced, fleeing government bombing, or actually moved outside the country. And Southern California actually got about 300,000
Yes.
Salvadorians during that period.
And they were admitted as, they were given asylum as political.
Many of them were. Others came undocumented
Yeah.
because they didn't have time to go through the process, because it is a lengthy process to be a documented immigrant at times. So many did come undocumented, but were later given political asylum because they had a legitimate fear for their own lives if they went back.
No, I read about the massacre at El Mazote. That was in the early 80s, right?
That is right.
And that was where the death squads moved into rebel territory in the highlands and basically massacred practically everyone in a village of 900.
Right.
Now, a New York Times reporter and a couple other journalists at great risk got in there, got the story, came back, printed it,
Right.
and the LA Times printed it, and I think the Washington Post. And very soon after that, it either died down, the State Department denied everything, the journalists' careers were ended, the whole thing was whitewashed, and it wasn't until after peace accords were signed and a UN mission went in and examined that they found out that in fact this had happened. The U.S. government had known about it
That is
and
true.
had basically clamped down on that information being disseminated so that they could continue with their policy of arming the death squads and the repressive government.
That's true. Now, El Mazote actually was a massacre committed by the armed forces of El Salvador.
That's right, not the death
Not
squads.
the death squads.
The official armed forces.
And the other interesting aspect is there was one eyewitness who survived,
Yeah.
and she actually testified to what she saw. And you're right, a whole village was wiped out.
Yeah.
And eventually that had to be acknowledged by the government of El Salvador. And of course they claimed that they would discipline army commanders responsible. But of course the Jesuit priests who were murdered in El Salvador, that was also the army of El Salvador. And they were simply pulled out of their rooms at the University of Central America and shot in cold blood, along with their housekeeper and her daughter. So now it is known how brutal, I mean, the general public is aware of how brutal the government of El Salvador was.
Yeah.
At the same time, our organization was being denounced by issuing misinformation and disinformation. But we have been vindicated because the Congress of the U.S. now is acknowledging that the government of El Salvador, its army, its paramilitary did violate many rights.
Now-
But you know what? But there's a very interesting thing that occurred. The war went on under the FMLN versus the armed forces of El Salvador from 1980 to 1992. Even though it's a country the size of Massachusetts that had received virtually $6 billion in U.S. military aid, the government of El Salvador could not defeat the guerrillas.
Yeah.
So in 1992, the government entered into negotiations, and in 1992, at Castillo Chapultepec in Mexico,
That's right.
the FMLN and the government signed peace accords, and
So the peace accords were signed in '92, and what were the terms? And then did the FMLN transfer itself into a political party, or what has happened with
yes,
that?
they did. And that is where some of the optimistic aspect of this comes in. We're kind of optimistic, and there have been some victories. The peace accords fundamentally changed Salvadorian political life. It ended the role of the military as the police force and created a new independent civilian police corps. The military was told to remain in its barracks, to not try to police the country as police are supposed to do, but to have only a role to defend the country against outside invasion and so on, and to be the traditional military role.
And they've stayed in
And
there.
to a large degree, this has occurred.
Well, that's
And
good
so
news.
this is a very important development because in many Central and South American countries, the military is really the police force and a political power. It's like a political party.
Sure.
So that changed. It also changed election. It had election reform in it. It also changed. It had agrarian reform, guaranteeing land to many people.
And has the land been distributed?
Yes, land has been distributed, and just this week, the agrarian debt of many campesinos has been forgiven by an act of the National Assembly under the leadership of this political party.
I see.
So in 1992, the FMLN moved to become a political party Up until 92, it was clandestine military army. And so today, the FMLN is the strong, strong second power in the country, with only one less seat in the National Assembly than the ruling Arena Party, which is an ultra-conservative party.
Now, their, their first forays into the electoral arena were not that successful.
They were
Is that
not.
correct?
That is true.
And there was dissension within the FMLN, and they were having trouble, as I remember, putting forward a unified policy or program.
You are absolutely right.
But it's in these elections that were held this year that they did become a major political force.
That is right. I was down for the first election and was an observer for the FMLN as an international observer. And we were frankly disappointed. And we wondered why it was that in that first election, the FMLN did not do as well as we wanted them to. There were several reasons. One, many people didn't think that it could go from an army in the mountains to state power in just a few months. And that was a legitimate concern. Secondly, the media, newspapers, radio, television are controlled by the oligarchy of the country and the I would call them at that time almost neo-fascist elements, and so the public was given a lot of disinformation. An example: once the candidate of the FMLN at the conference in Brazil over the environmental and remember in Brazil?
Yes, sure.
Well, Ruben Zamora, who was the candidate of the FMLN at that conference, at one point shook hands with Fidel Castro as a courtesy, and of course he's also an admirer of Fidel. And there were press pictures taken. So prior to the first election, on the front page of newspapers, this picture of Ruben Zamora and Fidel with a caption that the Cubans were preparing to enter El Salvador and help run it if the FMLN were to win the election. So there was enough disinformation and difficulties that they won only about 11 mayors and city councils, and they won only about 10 seats in the National Assembly. In the most recent election, they won 28 seats in the National Assembly, only one less than the Arena, and they won 52 mayors and city councils, including the mayors of San Salvador, the capital and largest city, and Santa Ana, the second largest city. So before you ask your next question, I love to tell people that more people in El Salvador today live under FMLN mayors than under Arena mayors. Not because we have more mayors, but because San Salvador and Santa Ana are FMLN coalition mayors, and they have huge populations in those cities.
It seems to me I've read that after peace broke out, that when you had suddenly a huge number of ex-military people with nothing to do, that this began to create civil problems, a lot of crime in the cities and such like that. What's the status of that now?
It is true. The crime rate in El Salvador is very high. A lot of what we call common crime is a major, major problem. Many members of the armed forces of the government of El Salvador were demilitarized. For many years they had been taught to kill and to, be in the mountains. They were taught to use weapons. And, I must be frank, members of the FMLN, there were thousands who were demilitarized, and there wasn't the capacity to retrain these people for civilian jobs. So I'm sorry to say, probably some of those folks also turned to crime as a way to, to survive.
But it's not surprising that after 12 years of civil war, that the society would continue to be somewhat dysfunctional.
That's true, and therefore you do have a lot of dysfunctional families, a lot of kids who are traumatized. You have a lot of people very resentful that their lives were stolen away. You have internal displacement. A very interesting project deals with young Salvadorians who grew up in Los Angeles. You see, some of the kids were brought here by their parents as babies, and they grew up on the streets of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And a couple of the gangs, particularly the Salvatrucha and the 18th Street, had a lot of Salvadorians in them. They're being deported now at the rate of about 250 a week. And when they arrive back in El Salvador, they often have no support system, and they are sometimes bilingual, sometimes only really English speaking,
yeah.
or poor Spanish. They have very few job skills. So there's a program in El Salvador now called Homies Unidos, and they're actually intercepting some of these kids at the airport and trying to get them into counseling, job training. In fact, Senator Tom Hayden has just been to El Salvador.
Really?
Tom Hayden met with the mayor of San Salvador and the chief of police, and Senator Hayden is helping to organize some support here for the project in El Salvador that will salvage the lives of some of these young people. The graffiti in San Salvador looks just like the graffiti on the walls of South Central, Lower Wilshire, around Normandy, beyond Wilshire. It's in English, and a lot of the kids, about 80% of the gangs in El Salvador are kind of homegrown. 20% and the leadership are kids who grew up here and have been deported back to El Salvador. So civil problems exist. Social and economic problems devastate the country right now.
And does the FMLN have somewhat of a plan, a program, or an agenda for rehabilitating this country?
Absolutely. And I'm glad to say that because of the power they have in the National Assembly and the fact that they have put together now a coalition of 5 other left-of-center parties. In a coalition, they have recently confronted the government of President Calderón Sol, the Arena president, and defeated his federal budget. They produced a second budget, which he was forced to sign, that gives much higher amounts of money to local communities, to mayors and city councils, to set up centers, youth centers, retraining, computer training centers, and so on, because traditionally the financial power was at the federal level and very little money was given to the cities. The FMLN believes those mayors and those city councils need resources to organize the youth in their own communities. And this was in fact, it made the LA Times and was worldwide news recently, where a coalition of actually 8 political parties, including the FMLN, and some that are pretty centrist, confronted the Arena Party, and for the first time in modern history, a presidential veto was overridden, and the president was forced to go along with the National Assembly rather than having a rubber stamp there. So
this reminds me somehow of what seems to be happening, although it's too soon to say, in Mexico, when for the first time the ruling PRI, has lost its clear majority in the assembly, and so that the assembly all of a sudden is no longer a rubber stamp for the PRI. And that's very encouraging.
It is encouraging, and that same coalition confronted the ruling Arena Party and passed a forgiveness of agricultural debt.
Let's get back to that. Yeah.
This is so important. In fact, when it happened, our national office in New York faxed out a victory statement to International Solidarity, because normally when they send us something, it's to do something. So when I saw this coming over the fax, I thought, well, there's an emergency. We're going to have to fight for someone's release. We're going to have to work on some. It was simply a statement congratulating International Solidarity Movement for the role they played in winning, for some farmers, a 100% forgiveness of their agrarian debt.
And what kind of debt is? What is?
Talk
about this.
Okay, it was debts that were imposed over many years by the banks and the financial interests controlled by Arena, because at times when farmers would try to establish cooperatives, the banks would say, fine, if you can do it, but you're not getting any credit for fertilizer, seeds, and so on. So the farmers who wanted to establish cooperatives and kind of communal farming arrangements were prevented from doing it because they always had to go to the banks, because none of them had the money to finance the planting, the crops, the fertilizer, and the animals that were needed. So over the years, many of these farmers accumulated huge debts. So there was even a threat that some of them would lose their lands.
I see.
And it was especially difficult during 12 years of civil war. So under this new National Assembly legislation that was just passed, people owing a certain amount of debt would have 100% forgiveness. Another percentage of debt, they would have to pay back 10%. Others, it would be a higher percent, depending on how much they owed, and the interest rates were reduced.
And did the private banks have to absorb the loss there?
Yes, well, not exactly. The government, it would not be fair in a way for, I suppose, private enterprise to just have the, so it has to be subsidized by the federal government.
Don, you sound quite optimistic in a lot of ways, and I'm certainly glad to hear that. But I have a general sense that in the world, as the global economy is spreading, as trade barriers, although not labor barriers, are being brought down, and companies are going where they can get the cheapest, most exploitive labor, and countries are bidding in a bidding war to see who can attract this, that these forces, these international economic forces, work against the possibility of a small country or small communities putting themselves on sound economic footing. What's happening about how are the people in El Salvador dealing with this?
That's a good question, because it's both a point of positive, some positive things are happening, but in general, you're absolutely right. If you look at Haiti, where workers get like 30 cents an hour to sew for the Disney Corporation, in Honduras, where the Gap is paying still very, very low wages for expensive clothing, all through Central America, Latin America, Asia, these maquiladoras, sweatshops, are functioning under horrendous situation. But you know, the Salvadorian people have a history of organizing and confronting challenge. So in El Salvador, we see many workers now taking on the issue of maquilas. They want to organize the workers in those sweatshops. They want independent monitoring, allowing independent monitors like the Archdiocese of the Catholic Church to come in and survey working conditions. They don't want forced overtime. They don't want their young people working there at the age of 14 and being told that if they take time out to go to school, they'll be fired, and so on. So in El Salvador, you have a few of these maquilas that have one union representation in at least one of them that sews for the Gap retail. They have independent monitoring, and there are people now in the labor movement in El Salvador focusing on organizing these young workers, many of whom are young women, not so much in the traditional union at first, because that is threatening to workers, but in workers' associations. The idea that they have a right to maternity leave, they have a right to some kind of health, time off to see doctors and so on. So we see some movement in El Salvador, I would say more than most Latin American countries, where workers are saying we want to be in control of our work life. They're helped by the fact that many FMLN members of the National Assembly see workers' rights as an issue that they must concentrate on. So unlike some other countries where there's no political thrust in the halls of Congress, in El Salvador, members of the National Assembly, members of the labor movement, young workers' associations are really working to hold these maquilas accountable. You know, the maquilas are not owned by the retailers like Walmart, Sears, Penny's. They're often Asian factories that
They're
are subcontractors.
contracting, yeah.
That's right. So they are confronting some of those, but it's a fine tightrope because they don't want them to close because they need the work, but they want the conditions improved.
Well, we have just a minute left. The oligarchies that have ruled for hundreds of years, are they laying down without a struggle?
Definitely not. Definitely not. That's why the FMLN is really working to consolidate its political base. There will be an election for president of El Salvador in 1999. Some objective observers believe that with the momentum they have at the municipal level, the momentum they have at the National Assembly level, they could actually move to the presidency of El Salvador in 1999. But the right wing, while it is riddled by scandal and also riddled by dissension, is not giving up. So you're going to see a vicious run for the presidency in '99 under those two primary parties.
Well, we'll be watching that, and I'm sure you'll be back to speak to us before then. Thanks a lot, Don.
It was great being here.